Biological changes over time. So for biological systems to change, it is going to be dependent primarily upon mutations. And essentially, random mutations can occur to the DNA of an organism, and therefore the instructional blueprints of an organism. These changes might create new versions of genes, and so they're going to have their original version. If there is a change to it, they could have a new, slightly different copy to that gene there. Now, if this happens where there aren't any genes, that's no big deal. There's probably nothing that's going to come of that. But if it does happen to a part of the genome that is coding for something, then it could change the gene itself. Or if it happens to a part of the genome that doesn't encode for anything currently, it could create something that then could encode for something. So mutation can be one of three things. It can be neutral. Most of them would be. A lot of most organisms' genomes, especially more complex organisms, there's a lot of material there that does not code for anything important, and so if it gets changed, it's no big deal. So there might be no effect to it. Most of the other changes, if they're not neutral, they're actually going to end up being harmful. So if you change something that's generally working pretty well, the chances are it's going to change it for the worse, especially since these changes are random, whether they happen or not, where they happen, what type of change they are, how they change the DNA itself is all random. And so most of the time it's neutral and doesn't do anything, or if it isn't neutral, it is probably going to be harmful. If you change a gene that has this particular function to do something new, that new thing is probably not going to help out. However, and very importantly, sometimes these changes can be beneficial. And if they change the organism's genes in a way that actually increases their chance of survival, so they have a greater chance of survival. Maybe the gene, they change a particular protein and maybe now it works a little bit better than it did before. Again, most of the time this doesn't happen. Most of the time if you change something that's working, it's going to be worse. But occasionally it does change it and it increases the chance of survival for the bearer of that change. And therefore, if they survive longer, they have a greater chance of reproduction. And if the carrier of that mutation reproduces, the mutation itself propagates and becomes more popular. So a quick reality check, even beneficial mutations, we're not talking about anything crazy different here. Most of them aren't extraordinarily different. In terms of a Hollywood-worthy superpower, that stuff doesn't happen. However, there are some incredibly interesting things that do happen. Everything, all of the biological diversity you see around you is because of these changes happening. And so one particular one that has happened to humans is that there's a particular spot where mutation has occurred, which allows adults to digest milk better. And so this isn't exactly a movie-worthy superpower, but it is a small change that can produce a benefit under certain circumstances. And remember that the benefits are always entirely dependent on the situation, but occasionally these mutations do create a beneficial change, which could help the bearer of those genes survive better in a particular situation, and that is a beneficial mutation. So most biological changes occur over thousands of generations. So we are looking at very low chance of these changes happening, and they're going to occur over a long period of time. And these changes over long periods of time are because it's such a long period of time that they are hard to perceive, or even actually to come up with the concept of how long these changes happen. It is difficult to do. So it takes an incredibly long time for these small changes to build up to the point of being able to explain all of the biological diversity that we see around us. So the fact that you look at an octopus and a tree, the difference between those organisms is due to these very small changes over an incredibly and inconceivably long period of time for our brain to handle, but they do build up and they do create the biodiversity we see around us. So quick, easier couple of examples to imagine would be viral and bacterial mutations, because these tiny microorganisms and viruses, their genetic material does change quite regularly because they replicate so quickly. And so if the changes occur during replication, the more replications there are, the more generations there are, the more likely they are to occur and build up. So essentially, things like bacteria who replicate really quickly can mutate very quickly. Antibiotics and vaccines, essentially, they then create an environment that encourages this sort of mutation. If bacteria don't mutate, they will die in an environment that has antibiotics present. Vaccines, same thing. If there's a vaccine for a particular virus, if it doesn't mutate, then it will be eliminated. So the selection pressure to mutate is very high. So anytime the conditions are right that are selecting against a particular organism, if they don't mutate and change the way in which they survive, so if a bacteria is going to be susceptible to antibiotics, if it doesn't mutate or pick up genes that allow it to survive those antibiotics, then it will die. Another aspect of this, another sort of easier thing to conceptualize would be selective breeding. So this is something that we've been doing for a long time, but essentially we have been artificially causing different organisms to change over a relatively short period of time. So we see this with dogs that we call the process domestication, but essentially we take organisms that are around and we selectively breed them for particular traits, and then we end up with certain versions of that organism that suit our needs or wants. So we select for these desirable traits in an organism, and we only allow that particular individual to breed. So if you have an orchard of apple trees and one of them is producing better apples than the other ones, then that's the tree you'd plant to grow more apple trees from. So you perpetuate certain traits that you like, and you do that over hundreds of generations, and you can start to slowly change the species. So individuals that get to reproduce are being selected for by humans. So that's the important part. So it is not a natural process that's happening. It's not the environment that is selecting for them. It is people who are making a conscious choice to select for a particular trait. And because of that, we refer to it as artificial selection. Same idea, there's some variation within a particular species, and we are selecting for particular ones, but it's not the environment doing it, it is humans, and therefore we refer to it as artificial selection. So steps to get this to happen: the species must be bred in captivity, so you have to have a controlled breeding of it, so it is not able to have any sort of mixing of genes, but only the ones specifically that we're looking for. And again, you want to start with a large number of them, so you have lots to choose from, and you can choose the ones that you like and leave the other ones you don't. Choose for these particular favorable traits, and so we look at these plants here, so you probably recognize a bunch of these plants that you would eat. They all descend from the same native wild plant. So cabbage and kale and broccoli and Brussels sprouts, they're all from the same brassica original plant, but what we've done is we've bred them for particular traits that we like, and we've gotten these different outcomes for that. We've selectively bred these plants, we've domesticated this wild brassica, and we've created all of these domesticated versions of that plant that have traits that we have selected for artificially. So we breed only the organisms that show the traits that we're looking for. So if you're looking for the particular traits in broccoli, then you've only reproduced the ones. If you happen to have one that showed up with maybe not as many green flower buds and instead they have white ones, then maybe that's what you want to select for, but you'd end up with a divergence between those two types, and you'd end up with cauliflower versus broccoli, even though they originally came from the same wild ancestor. Keep doing this over many, many generations, and you can end up with a large variety of them. And we continue to do this. So broccoli is not the end. There is many other options that we can continue to choose for particular traits and breed these new organisms. Problems with this is that by definition we're losing the genetic diversity of the population, and we know that with less diversity we lose the ability to survive adversity. So the species becomes vulnerable to different diseases and changes in conditions. Certain genetic disorders get perpetuated as well, because if you're selecting for certain traits, there may be other traits that are not so good that may come along with those ones as well. And so certain breeds of dogs we've selected for particular traits, but along with those has come some undesirable traits, and they've been perpetuated in that population as well. And Obviously, if the species that we have domesticated were to try to survive without our help, if we've selected it specifically to live in the conditions with us, then it may not be able to survive on its own anymore because of what we've done to it through the domestication and artificial selection process.